Violence against women and children is still a very real issue in South Africa. That is why it is the focus of the 2025 South African Child Gauge. The report looks at how these forms of violence are interlinked and how we can build safer and healthier families and communities. Stay tuned because we are about to speak to one of the contributors who will help us understand this issue and share what we can do to make a change.
The South African Gauge is the flagship research publication of the Children's Institute, and the 2025 issue brought together over 70 researchers, policymakers, and practitioners as chapter authors and case study authors. Now, this 18th edition of the Child Gauge focuses on the intersections of violence against women and children. Now, to help us understand this very intricate topic a bit better, we are joined by one of the lead editors of the Child Gauge, Lucy Jamieson. Now, the Child Gauge looks at both violence against children and violence against women. Now, how are these two forms of violence linked, and why is it so important to look at them together?
So, in the first place, they often happen in the same households. So, children and women who are living together often experience different forms of violence in the same household. The other thing that happens is that children witness violence against their mothers. And what a lot of people don't know, and your listeners may be interested in, is that the effects of witnessing violence can be just as harmful and just as traumatic to children as actually experiencing violence. And what happens when children experience violence or see violence at home is that it drives what we call an intergenerational cycle. Now, that means that children are more likely to be violent towards their peers, but also in the long run, that they themselves are more likely to be victims of violence, more likely to be perpetrators of violence, and to use harsh or violent parenting methods against their own children. So when children experience violence, it lasts throughout their lifetime and is passed on to their children and their children's children often.
Now, Lucy, what are the main things that put children and women at greater risk of violence, and how do harmful social and gender norms make this worse?
So there are a lot of the things that put children and women at greater risk of violence, we call the drivers of violence. And some of those are structural violence and structural drivers. Those are things like poverty, unemployment, overcrowding. So problems that affect the whole of society. There are also kind of individual level factors like alcohol abuse or marital conflict in the home, particular stresses that families might face, like food insecurity is one of the things that can lead to violence. So all these different things, and usually it's not one single thing that causes violence, it's all these things or several of these things coming together. But you also touched on harmful social norms. So what do we mean when we talk about harmful social norms? So a social norm is a belief that's held by the community. It's also held by individuals as part of that community. And the kinds of things that we're talking about here are gender norms. So that's expectations about how girls and boys behave. So typically, boys are expected to be tough and girls are expected to be more caring and emotional. And those norms, unfortunately, in South Africa also include tolerating violence. So many people think it's acceptable to hit a woman. Many people still believe that it's acceptable to hit a child. And so those are what we call harmful social norms. So those kind of common beliefs that are seen to be leading to or supporting or condoning violence.
Mm-hmm. Now, what is the cost of violence for children, families, and communities, including how it can pass from one generation to the next?
So this is quite a complicated. The cost of violence is huge. Now it has what we call, social costs. It has economic costs, and when you look at the cost to children, let's start with children. Obviously, there are immediate impacts on their health and well-being. So, if you are experiencing violence, then you may have to see a doctor or go to the hospital. There's pain, there's suffering involved. But what tends to, those kind of injuries heal. What tends to take longer to heal and is invisible is the impact, the psychological impact, the trauma. And that trauma can cause all sorts of problems for children. Number one, it interferes with their ability to learn. So when children are at school, children who've experienced violence find it more difficult to concentrate. They are afraid, so that over the course of time is impacting on their education and stopping them doing as well as possible at school. And when you look at it in terms of our communities, the impact that violence can have, we have lots of different forms of violence in our communities, but how is violence against women and children that typically takes place either in the home or at school impacting on our communities? Well, it stops people reaching their full potential. So it means that they are not able to effectively contribute. So they are less productive at work. They use more services like social services, hospital services, police services, and the courts. And all of those services have a cost. And one of the things that we do in the Gauge is add up how and try and put a monetary value, although that's not necessarily the best way to look at these costs. But if you put a monetary value to the number of days that children lose at school, the impact on their education, what it does to them, and how it limits their potential to contribute as adults to society, plus the direct costs of providing services, it works out at a huge, what is called 5% of gross domestic product. So that's when you think of all of the money that the South African economy generates from all of our businesses, all of the people that work here, 5% of that is wasted due to violence against women and children. So huge personal and economic costs.
One of the big themes this year is that services often work in silos and families struggle to get the help they need. Now, Lucy, what are the gaps in the funding, access, and coordination that make support difficult?
This is again anybody who has tried to use services will understand that, if you go and report an incident to the police, that often there's a very good link with what they call the Thuthuzela care centres. Now, a Thuthuzela care centre is about collecting evidence of a crime that's happened. But what people need is not just a criminal justice response. They need access to therapy. They may need access to medical services, and they need help in the long term to get over the impact of violence. And government departments don't talk to each other. So what you'll often find is that it's very difficult after a woman or a child has reported violence, for them to, they'll get a response from the police services, but it's then difficult to get a social worker or to get a therapist to help them. And not only that kind of what we call a continuum of care. So that's where an individual receives all of the services that they need. So that is often broken or fragmented, as you say, because services work in silos. But as we've talked earlier, women and children in the same household experience violence. So if a child has experienced violence, it's likely that mum and their siblings have too. Same as if a woman goes to report violence, the police need to ask, well, what about your children? Have they been exposed to violence? Have they witnessed this violence at home? But our services aren't good at looking at the needs of the family. They tend to focus on the individual who's in front of them. So those silos affect people in two ways. One, that continuum, that chain of care is broken, but also we treat women and children separately, which isn't the best way of supporting families or breaking that cycle of violence.
Now, Lucy, what needs to change so that all our systems, from schools to clinics to social services, can work together and provide better protection and care for children and women?
So the first thing that we've got to do, and your listeners will all be aware of the 16 days of activism. And every year people say, we've got to work together. It's everybody's responsibility to tackle violence against women and children. But as I've said, the reality is that it doesn't happen in practice. And the very first thing that we have to do is recognize that health services and schools, for example, really do have a responsibility in preventing violence, in responding to violence. Most schools think that their role is to provide education. And that is actually by thinking that we've got a responsibility to, as a school, to play our part in ending violence. And our core goal is to deliver education. We can bring those two things together. We mentioned earlier in our discussion about harmful social norms. So schools can be places where children learn about what we call gender equality, about, positive masculinities, about fair ways of distributing work within the household, treating each other with respect and dignity. And children don't need to just learn that from textbooks in schools. They can live that. So we have to make sure that our schools are free from bullying, and where people and where children and teachers and anyone who's involved there feels safe and comfortable and respected. So learn it, live it, but schools can be used to identify and respond. So as I said to you earlier, children who are experiencing violence at home, often that impacts on their education. So teachers will notice that children are coming in late, they're coming in tired, maybe they're dirty, or their schoolwork is suffering, or there's higher rates of absenteeism than normally. All of those things are indicators that a child is struggling, and it may be that there's violence happening, so that the school can then either have a social worker or a child and youth care worker on their staff, or refer to a social worker, child and youth care worker service in their school district. So it's about thinking differently. Schools are still teaching children, but they teach children in different ways. As I said, there's what they learn from the curriculum, there's what they experience from being in schools, and there's how schools should be responding to individual incidents.
So, Lucy, just to end off, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
I think one of the things that, we still have to deal with is that violence on an individual level is often a taboo subject. So people don't want to, we can all talk about violence in the community. We can all say that violence against women and children is a bad thing. But when it comes to reporting violence against someone we know or ourselves, it's much more difficult. So the thing I'd like to add for your listeners is to, just underscore that violence shouldn't be happening to you as a child. And there are lots of different ways that you can reach out for help. Now, a lot of what the studies show is that a lot of children reach out to their friends. So whether you or a friend is experiencing violence, it's really important to find help. Childline is a really good way to connect into that, but find a trusted adult and engage them and make sure that you get the kind of help that you deserve.
Lucy, thank you so much for joining me today. That was a very informative interview.
Brilliant. And it's always lovely to be on RX Radio.
Thank you.